Hey everyone, welcome back to Bible Bits. We're moving on into Genesis chapter 4 now, getting into kind of the prehistory of Israel. I call it the prehistory not because it's any indication that these things didn't happen or anything like that, but because clearly there's a section of scripture from Genesis 1 to Genesis 11 that's not intended to be a thorough history of earth or anything like that. It's not until we get to Abraham that things slow way down and we really get kind of a comprehensive look at what's going on in the world, specifically through what's going on with Abraham and his life. Prior to that, things are happening just like that. There's one after the other, huge jumps in time. Clearly, it's not meant to be a thorough history of mankind. Rather, it's to give us, I guess you might call the bullet points, if you will, of what's going on with mankind. We had the first sin, that was the first bullet point, but now we have the first murder here with Cain. But we're not going to get to the murder quite yet today. Instead, we want to take a look at the very beginning of chapter 4 and see what the scripture has for us. Chapter 4, starting in verse 1. Now Adam knew Eve his wife, and she conceived and bore Cain, saying, I have gotten a man with the help of the Lord. And again she bore his brother Abel. Now Abel was a keeper of sheep, and Cain a worker of the ground. In the course of time Cain brought to the Lord an offering of the fruit of the ground, and Abel also brought of the firstborn of his flock and of their fat portions. And the Lord had regard for Abel and his offering, but for Cain and his offering he had no regard. So Cain was very angry, and his face fell. His face fell basically means dejected, depressed. Obviously we don't really use that term anymore, but we got to work with what we got with translations. The Lord said to Cain, Why are you angry, and why is your face fallen? If you do well, will you not be accepted? And if you do not well, sin is crouching at the door. Its desire is contrary to you, but you must rule over it. Now there's a little bit to unpack here. We can sometimes, I think, get stuck on what it was that Cain brought versus what it was that Abel brought. But I don't think that was the real issue at hand. Cain brings the first fruits of the ground. That is, well, I guess it doesn't say the first fruits, rather just the fruit of the ground. Presumably this was harvest, some kind of harvest, we think of like wheat, things like that. Presumably it was something like that. But Abel brings the flock. And of course, as we go through, we see the sheep and bulls are considered substitutions for mankind's sins as we go forward into the old covenant. But we don't have an old covenant yet. And so there's no indication that God was requiring of Cain something that he wasn't bringing. Rather, what seems to have been the issue is that Cain had the wrong attitude. Now, we don't see that necessarily in Genesis. We can kind of infer it, and obviously we see later on as he goes and he commits murder. Clearly, he did not have a good heart, but we can look later on in Scripture to see how some of the New Testament writers looked at this. 1 John 3, starting in verse 12. Do not be like Cain, who belonged to the evil one and murdered his brother. And why did he murder him? Because his own actions were evil and his brothers were righteous. Here we see Cain basically was jealous or envious of Abel. Abel was an upstanding guy. He was a good guy. And Cain he wasn't quite meeting that mark. And so he was getting jealous of him, envious of what he was doing. And so he commits murder. He commits the first murder in Scripture. But Hebrews explains it a little bit further, I think. Hebrews 11, starting in verse 4. By faith, Abel brought God a better offering than Cain did. By faith, he was commended as righteous when God spoke well of his offering. And by faith, Abel still speaks even though he is dead. What was the difference between Abel and Cain? The writer of Hebrews seems to think it was their faith. Abel had faith. He brought his offering to God in faith. He brought his offering to God, trusting God, believing God to take care of him, trusting God as the Lord of the universe, bringing what he had as an offering. Cain seemed not to have that same attitude. Now, obviously, we don't have a great detail about Cain's life. We don't know what kind of man he was throughout. He had some issues. He clearly had an anger issue. He goes and kills Abel soon after. But, we don't know that Cain was just an awful, awful guy for the entirety of his life. but he doesn't seem to have had faith in God. He doesn't seem to have trusted God the way he needed to. And it was that lack of trust, that lack of putting his foundation in God, that leads him to look at what Abel's doing, and rather than rightly saying to himself, I have an issue I need to fix, he instead says, I'm jealous of what you have, I'm going to take it from you. This leads us to a couple points about humanity. The first point of humanity, I think, is we are not innately good. It's a temptation in the modern age to get this kind of belief that, oh, everybody's just, they're good at heart. Everyone's good at the core. That's simply not true. Certainly mankind is capable of good. We're capable of doing good things, but our history is not one of good. In fact, absent following and seeking after God, our history is largely one of terror, one of selfishness, one of greed. That's not to say that people who have professed the name of Christ have been perfect throughout history. Clearly we have not. But we also can look back and say that those who do wrong things in the name of God are clearly going against Scripture, going against what God has said. But when we look at what people do when they're against Scripture, when they're outside of God's will, when they're not seeking to follow His commands, what are our innate behaviors? We're selfish. We do things for our own sake. We strive after our own desires. Even today, in America, what is the number one thing that a person that's considered part of the American dream? Strive after what you want. Get what you want. Fix what you want for your life. Fix it up for yourself. Get yourself money. Get yourself a nice house. Get yourself a good family. Now, there's nothing wrong with any of those things in their own context, but the context here is selfishness. And selfishness leads us to do things that we know we shouldn't do. Getting what I want in a selfish manner means I'm not afraid to steal. I'm not afraid to do something I know is wrong. I'm not afraid to cheat around the edges a little bit. Or, as Cain was, maybe not even afraid to murder. Mankind is not innately good. We have to strive after the good. We have to go towards the good. That is God. And it's only there the better part of our nature is pulled up. I don't think it's a mistake that man is made on the same day as the beasts of the field in Genesis 1. Throughout Scripture, when you see man, when he's committing sin and doing evil, so often when he's in that state, that selfish, sinful state, he's compared to an animal. Not to a fish, not to a bird, to the animals. Why? Because in that state, he's acting on his instinct. He's acting like that base creature that was made before him. But when man chases after God, when he goes after what is good, he gets put in his proper place. We see that better version of man, that version of man that was made after God's own image. The second thing I think we need to pay attention to here in Genesis 4 is that even from the very beginning, mankind has known he needed to do something to fix his relationship with God. Cain and Abel both recognized we need to do something to fix this problem, this issue of our nature not being perfect. I'm sure Adam and Eve gave them some kind of story. I don't imagine that they hid from them why it is they are wandering out in the wilderness and where they came from. I'm sure they knew the story. Clearly they knew about God, otherwise they wouldn't have brought offerings to him. I'm sure they knew the situation. And they recognized we aren't perfect. We have not hit the mark, and so we need to do something. That hasn't changed throughout history. Throughout history, mankind has recognized we're not where we need to be. Sometimes our answer to that is chasing after God, seeking after Him more nearly, bringing what we have and laying it before Him, as Abel did. More often than not, though, our answer is seeking to take what others have, build ourselves up with what others have, build ourselves up by trying to get ahead any way we can. Maybe if we fill the void a little bit more with things, eventually we'll be complete. But Cain was never going to be complete in that manner. What he does then in the upcoming chapter is monstrous. He commits the first real terrible sin against humanity. Adam and Eve sinned. Their sin was against God. But Cain's sin is against man. Cain kills his own brother. You don't do that because your heart is right. You don't do that because you're in a place of peace with God. You do that because you're trying to fix something in a manner that can't fix it. Because you're seeking to fill a hole that won't be filled without the proper peace. Cain didn't understand what that proper peace was. He was striving after it, but he wasn't seeing it. He knew his brother's offering was accepted, but he couldn't grasp why. As the writer of Hebrews said, it was because Abel had faith. He put his trust in God. He took his stuff and he put it in God's hands. Cain didn't get it. Let's strive not to be like Cain. Let's strive to be like Abel, taking what we have, taking our desire to be better people and putting them in God's hands. Putting our righteousness not in what we've done, not in what we can bring to the table, but in who God is. That's all we have here for today. I hope this is helpful for you as we go through Scripture here and reveal Genesis a little more nearly. Next, we'll get into Cain's murder, which it's a very interesting story because God doesn't react to Cain the way that you think that God should react to Cain, the way we would react to Cain. And we'll talk about that next week. But until then, we'll see you guys in the next video. Bye, everyone.